In light of all of this, and in light of how some of my so-called leftist liberal friends have been writing me, I can see that the seams are beginning to bust on their support for the clowned one, Cousin Barry Obama. I have written a new article, which I'll be putting up at deadlinelive.info. You could say this is what's boiling my blood, but in a way, my blood is somewhat cooling, looking at how this is all beginning to fall apart. It took about 8 months. I can say at least they're catching on a little quicker than the Republicrats, than the Stepford Republicans, the groupthink, brainwash, Kool-Aid drinking Republicans. It took them roughly 4 or 5 to 6 years. Some of them are still under the illusion that what Bush and Cheney did for the country was good. So I've written an article entitled, Open Letter to Left-Wing Omerica. Watch out for the Kool-Aid crash. I was never much for Kool-Aid. Too sugary and fake. Too cheap and no fizz. And the buzz is too short-lasting, unlike Jameson's. The crash is violent and depressing. In either case, I bought some recently as it was on sale at the local Poison Mart. I hadn't drank it since I was a kid, and I wanted to see if I still hated it. I also wanted to see what my 6-year-old son would do after consuming it. I got the lemonade and cherry flavors. It didn't have much of an effect on me. It seems that I might now be immune to Kool-Aid. But my son displayed some fairly predictable side effects. First, he was branded with a red dye stain that had the unmistakable aura of death. It reminded me of the Obama as Joker posters that had been circulating on the streets of America. I find those posters quite ironic, as young Barry wrote in his first grade essay when he was growing up that he wanted to be Batman. Guess the joke's on you, Barry. Secondly, my boy, after effects on Kool-Aid, started running around with no certain direction, like a whirling dervish, almost possessed. His face became contorted, his voice frenetic and growling. Usually a kind and thoughtful child, he became confused and almost violent, unable to hear any reason or understand the inevitable consequences of his actions. Then came the crash. Like a record player that has lost its power, slower and slower and slower and stop. A vacant stare erased the previous red grimace. Finally, the senses began to return to quote-unquote normal. I thought a daily intake of this drug, refined sugar, would lead to a direct countermeasure of Prozac or Ritalin, which is why we are back on natural juice, filtered water, Enerfood, and raw milk. So it seems that the alleged left wing has begun to return to their senses. The Kool-Aid seems to be wearing off. Hey, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Received a letter today from Democrats.com asking their readers to stand up with U.S. Senators Russ Feingold, Democrat from Wisconsin, Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, John Tester, Democrat from Montana, Tom Udall, Democrat from New Mexico, Jeff Bingham, Democrat from New Mexico, Bernie Sanders, Independent Socialist from Vermont, Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, recently under indictment. Oh, no, that's right, he's not under indictment for fixing the FDA on behalf of the drug companies. I guess that's not going to happen. And Daniel Akaka, unfortunate name, Democrat from Hawaii, Jeff Merkley, Democrat from Oregon, and Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon. Of course, there was no mention in this letter of Republican Congressman Ron Paul. Well, I guess Rome wasn't built in a day, though it was destroyed in one, and the after effects of Kool-Aid are slow to wear off. This is a letter I got. Repeal telecom immunity and roll back Patriot Act abuses. Say it so. Quote, it's time to repeal telecom immunity for illegal spying and roll back the worst abuses of the Patriot Act. When we finally lost our hard-fought battle over telecom immunity for illegal spying, thank you, Democrat James Harmon, who, by the way, was caught later on wiretaps herself, the very wiretaps that she was out shilling for, saying that she would go along with this if she wouldn't be prosecuted for covering up espionage on behalf of AIPAC in Israel. We finally lost our hard-fought battle over the telecom immunity for illegal spying. Civil libertarians, or even constitutionalists, in the Senate vowed to revisit the issue during the next Congress. Now is the time. Senators Russ Feingold and Dick Durbin have now introduced the Justice Act to bring an end to the telecom immunity and roll back some of the worst abuses of the Patriot Act. Now, for those of us purists out there, we might just say, repeal it. But the answer generally in a political realm is to put together even more legislation to counteract the legislation, and this is what they've seen fit to do. On December 31st of this year, 3 key provisions of the USA Patriot Act are set to expire. And the House and the Senate, they have a trifecta. Will hold hearings on reauthorization. Feingold and Durbin are using the Patriot Act reauthorization process to reverse Bush-era laws that take away our constitutionally guaranteed rights. The Justice Act would completely repeal the provisions of the FISA Amendments Act, intended to legally immunize big telecoms that illegally assisted in the National Security Agency's warrantless wiretapping program. It would restore protections for the privacy of library and bookstore records. And it would also add strong checks and balances to Patriot Act provisions governing FISA orders, wiretaps, and national security letters. In the days following the attacks of September 11th, Congress passed, at the behest of the Bush administration, a raft of legislation that greatly expanded domestic spying programs but failed to include constitutional safeguards. Finally, the champions of the constitutional rights in the Senate are taking steps to undo the worst of the damage. Our friends and allies at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Campaign for Reader Privacy, which includes the American Library Association, American Booksellers Association, Association of American Publishers, and PEN American Center, believe that the Justice Act is our best chance for reform this year. Please join them and us in supporting this bill. Unlike the duped New Left Dems, I have stood up since this. I, Jack Blood, have stood up against this Patriot Act since the revelations of the Patriot Act in 2002. I went to my city hall in Providence, Rhode Island with 150 others and a live radio broadcast from inside the hollowed chambers, and we forced a complete and unanimous repeal of the Patriot Act in our city. Now, I found out later that this had no bearing on the federal control of our city and the far-reaching, freedom-snatching edicts of the USA Patriot Act. Thus, I conclude that it will be up to the Democrats to drive this issue today, as Ron Paul did during the Bush administration. We on the right aren't exactly carrying a lot of clout these days, being dismissed as teabaggers, nutsuckers, retards, racists, terrorists, gun-toting backwoods extremists. As we stood shoulder to shoulder with you for 8 years, it's now your place in time to return the flavor. You must demand the quote-unquote change you allegedly voted for by helping all Americans in our effort to legalize freedom. The Obama administration is afraid of losing control of their base. They, in many ways, rule by consensus. Now that you're coming out of your Kool-Aid coma, quote-unquote, you have no excuses. Hell, even Michael Moore and Bill Maher are beginning to realize that the real change will only come with pressure on the Goldman Sachs administration. The water is warm. Jump in. Otherwise, what we all just witnessed at the Pittsburgh G20 will be everyday fun in the good old USSA. That will be posted at deadlinelive.info with links and pictures and everything that goes with it. Does it comfort you? Is it really the best way to go about all of this? Putting together more legislation to cross out or exempt previous freedom-stealing legislation? Or would it be really preferable just to get a movement of repeal going here, to just repeal the entire thing and set back history?